In 1959, a psychological experiment called the Ganzfeld effect demonstrated that prolonged sensory deprivation could lead to auditory and visual hallucinations. Participants reported hearing whispers, seeing shadows, and sensing presences that weren't there. Imagine then if what you thought was a hallucination wasn't. Tonight, in episode 6 of Shadows of the Mind, we delve into the darkness where reality and delusion collide. The storm outside clawed at the cabin, the wind howling like a living thing. Inside, the silence was suffocating. Jacob stood in the middle of the room, staring at the shards of the shattered mirror that still reflected fragments of the room. Each piece seemed to glow faintly in the candlelight, casting eerie patterns on the wooden walls. The journal on his desk was open, its pages trembling slightly as if moved by an unseen breeze. The last entry lingered in his mind. "You invited me in." Jacob's hand shook as he reached for the journal. He turned the page slowly, his breath catching as he saw new words appearing on the aged paper, scrawled in a jagged, hurried script. In December 26, 1949, Elias's journal. It's closer now. The Watcher. It sees through the cracks. If you're reading this, don't look. Don't let it see you. Burn the journal. Smash the glass. And if it speaks, don't answer. Jacob looked around the room. The shards of the broken mirror were still there, yet the mirror itself had reappeared. Whole, intact, hanging ominously on the wall as if it had never shattered. His heart pounded in his chest as he stepped closer, his reflection shimmering in the rippling surface. He grabbed a sheet from the couch and threw it over the mirror, covering it completely. The crackling sound of the storm outside grew louder, drowning out his frantic breaths. But then he heard it, a faint whisper from beneath the sheet, barely audible but unmistakable. "Jacob!" He stumbled back, knocking over the chair behind him. The sheet began to move, slowly sliding down the mirror, as if pulled by invisible fingers. When the glass was revealed, his reflection was gone. The mirror showed only the room behind him, but darker, more twisted. And then a shape, a figure, stepped into view. The Watcher's house loomed in the snowstorm, its crumbling facade barely visible through the blinding wind. Elias stood at the threshold, his flashlight cutting a narrow path of light through the darkened interior. The whispers had begun again, faint and rhythmic, like a heartbeat. The air inside was colder than outside, dense with the scent of mildew and something metallic. He stepped carefully, his boots crunching on a layer of frost that had crept over the floorboards. The hallway stretched longer than it should have, its walls warped and lined with shadows that shifted when he wasn't looking directly at them. He knew where he was headed. The second-floor room where Alice Marlowe had been found days before her disappearance. Her journal had mentioned the mirror. "It watches me," she had written, "but it's waiting for something." When Elias entered the room, he froze. The mirror was no longer hanging on the wall. The cracked plaster showed faint outlines of where it had been mounted. His mind raced. He had removed the mirror, taken it to his apartment. Yet the whispers were louder here, more concentrated. His flashlight swept across the room until it landed on the floor. There, in the center of the room, lay a small, circular shard of glass. It pulsed faintly, the light within casting eerie shadows. Elias crouched to pick it up, his fingers trembling as he brought it closer to his face. The shard was warm to the touch, and as he held it, the whispers merged into a single, clear voice. "You never left." Elias dropped the shard and stumbled back, his breathing erratic. The shard began to ripple, its surface expanding and reforming into the familiar warped reflection of the mirror he had taken. It was as if the mirror had returned, piece by piece, drawn back to this place. The reflection in the glass wasn't his own. The grotesque, elongated features stared back at him, a twisted grin spreading across its face. The whispers began again, louder, more insistent. Elias raised his gun. He aimed directly at the center of the shard and fired. The room erupted with light as the shard shattered, its fragments scattering across the floor. But when the light faded, the whispers remained. Jacob couldn't stay in the cabin any longer. The journal's entries were becoming too real, too connected to what he was experiencing. He packed a bag, taking the journal and a flashlight, and ventured out into the storm. The snow whipped against his face as he trudged through the forest, following the faint trail of footprints he hadn't noticed before. The trail led to a clearing where an old, abandoned church stood. Its steeple was bent, and the stained glass windows were shattered. Jacob hesitated, but something, a pull he couldn't explain, drew him inside. The interior was dark, the pews covered in frost. At the altar, a mirror stood upright, its surface glowing faintly. Jacob approached it, his heart pounding. The journal in his bag grew heavier with each step. When he reached the mirror, he saw not his own reflection, but Elias staring back at him. "Who are you?" Jacob whispered, his voice trembling. Elias's reflection didn't move, but the journal in Jacob's bag burst open, its pages flipping wildly. Words began to form on the blank pages. "You already know." Elias's flashlight flickered as the shadows in the room deepened. The whispers had become deafening, a chorus of voices speaking in unison. The mirror on the wall rippled, and the watcher stepped through. Its form was humanoid but wrong, its limbs too long, its face a void save for two glowing eyes. Elias fired his gun, but the bullets passed through it, shattering the mirror behind. The watcher's voice echoed in his mind. "You can't escape." Elias stumbled back, his breaths coming in ragged gasps. He felt the cold grip of its presence as it moved closer. Desperate, he grabbed a shard of the broken mirror and slashed at the figure. The shard glowed brightly as it made contact, and the watcher recoiled, its form flickering. The room erupted in light, and Elias was thrown back into the hallway. When he opened his eyes, the mirror was gone, and the whispers had stopped, but the shadow of the watcher lingered in the corners. Jacob collapsed to his knees in front of the glowing mirror in the church. Elias's reflection began to change, morphing into the watcher. Its glowing eyes locked onto Jacob's, and the journal in his bag ignited, flames licking at its edges. The watcher stepped closer, its voice filling the empty church. "You brought me here." Jacob screamed as the mirror shattered, the shards embedding themselves in the walls. The flames consumed the journal, leaving behind only ash. When the fire died, the church was empty, save for Jacob and the faint sound of whispers echoing in the dark. Fear is a mirror, reflecting not what we are, but what hunts us. Jacob and Elias's paths are no longer separate, but intertwined, bound by the watcher's gaze. What is the watcher? And what does it want? The answers lie deeper in the shadows. Join us for episode 7 of Shadows of the Mind, where the truth begins to emerge.